finish with, I know that this is all debating contract law, and isn't this whole situation complex for somebody like me, an ordinary bloke parking my car? I'm not cognizant of contract law. Isn't the whole situation over complex and over complicated?
I completely agree with you, and we've pressed the government over many years to introduce some regulation in this area. They've chosen not to. But it's really confusing for most motorists who just don't understand the ins and outs, as you say, of contract law. What's the difference between a local authority car park, which is run under statute, and a private car park, which is run under contract law? So let's keep some pressure on the government to establish some standards around this and some regulation which makes it easier for all to understand.
Thank you very much. That's Patrick Troy. Thank you, Patrick, the Chief Executive of the British Parking Association. Represents those supermarkets and businesses that send those tickets out and runs the independent appeals service when you want to dispute your fines. One thing if I can paraphrase Patrick on that, because I know that my neighbours that were penalised were really quite upset by that. You can appeal. It's very easy to think, well, it's a waste of time appealing. It's actually not. You keep your paperwork and you appeal. Jeanette Miller is a motoring lawyer here in Manchester who specialises in cases such as this. And Jeanette joins me now. Jeanette, good morning.
Morning, Mike.
So we've heard the debate so far. What's your thoughts on it, Jeanette?
Well, I'm more along the lines of what you were saying, to be honest, Mike. I think the private parking industry, and I say it's an industry, are looking towards the motorist as a cash cow. One of the things that Patrick, who you just had on, did not mention, I don't think, was the fact that apparently 45% of appeals against private parking tickets sent to the British Parking Association appeal, which is popular, apparently 45% won in the last year. So if we've got a system where 45%, almost half of the tickets issued, are successfully appealed, surely that has got to beg the question, what's being done wrong? And that's what the RAC report's all about today. There's a real problem with an unintended consequence, I think, of clamping being brought to an end, because obviously I think everybody welcomed the end of clamping. But as a result of the companies, the landowners not being able to clamp and get their money on the spot, they're now more and more imposing excessive charges like the ones you've just mentioned for perhaps just a couple of minutes overstaying or some very minor breach of the contract, and you're right, it is contract law. So the issue now is that the parking companies are levying very high charges for what really isn't a loss that they're suffering, and that's what the RAC are seeking to try to bring to everybody's attention. One of the things that could solve all of this is just adding one word to the legislation that was brought in to clamp down on, to stop clamping rather, and just inserting the word reasonable when it comes to what the charge should be, and then defining what reasonable is, because a lot of these companies are issuing parking charge notices sort of £85 plus for something which was potentially free parking in the first place.
Jeanette, what would your thoughts be on the moral dimension of the fact that a government organisation, the DVLA, which obviously we pay for through our taxes, gives or could give my address and details to a private company so that private company can then trace me and try to find me?
Well, that was, I suppose, the trade-off of stopping the clamping from happening. One of the problems with private parking situations is that until the law changed in 2012, it was only the driver, the person who had parked, that could be pursued. So that's why clamping was really so common, because they couldn't necessarily prove who'd been driving a vehicle unless they forced that person to have to call them to get the clamp off the car. So stopping clamping then meant they had to do something else to make it possible for the private landowners to pursue the motorist, and it's actually not the motorist anymore that's pursued, it's the owner of the vehicle.
A couple of quick questions to finish, Jeanette. A lot of talk on social media, just ignore the ticket. What would your advice be on that?
Well, unfortunately, that would be solid advice before the introduction of these laws. It's no longer possible to just ignore, although if you do ignore, and I'm not giving legal advice here, the chances are that there could be no further action, but strictly speaking, that is no longer good advice.
Yeah, my personal experience is I ignored one once and nothing happened, but I wouldn't advise you. I'm not advising you to take my action. And finally, what would you, as a motoring lawyer, what would you like to see happen or to change, or what sort of evolution of this system would you like to see?
I think there's got to be simplification of the appeals process. I think inserting the word reasonable into the legislation and bringing some clarity into what the charge should be in private parking situations would make everybody feel less aggrieved by the situation when they do get the ticket on the car. And I think that something has to be done to look into why so many appeals are upheld. What's going on at the ground level with the parking enforcement in the first place?
Jeanette, thank you so much for talking to us. Jeanette Miller, motoring lawyer here in Manchester, specialises.
That was brilliant, Jeanette. Thank you so much.
All
Cheers.
right.
Bye-bye. Bye.